Creating all the marker managing functionality within the Mapster library can really clutter things up. And it also muddies the responsibility of the library. The library is really a resource of common functionality that we do with the Google Maps API. If we want to manage a collection of objects, we should have our own construct that knows how to do that. And this is known as the single responsibility principle. And a responsibility is anything that has the tendency to change. So if you isolate the responsibility to their respective places, it makes your code much easier to maintain. So in this lesson, we're going to focus on creating a module that knows how to manage any type of object. And in this case, we're going to use it to manage the markers. So previously, we created this add marker, remove marker, and find marker by lat function. And placing all these functions within the Mapster library can really clutter things up. So let's go and create a new file, and we're going to call it list.js. After our self-invoking anonymous function, we'll start declaring our module. And if you remember, we start by declaring a self-invoking anonymous function, and we store that to a variable. And then within that variable, we declare a constructor function. We'll set the prototype for the constructor function, and then we'll return the constructor function itself. So now this list variable holds the constructor function, not the results of the constructor function. Then we'll create our factory method. And now we have the boilerplate for our list module. So using this list, we'll be able to add and remove and find any object of any type within it. So the list will have items within it. So we'll create a property for that and set it to an empty array. And then we're going to need our functions. So we'll just create stubs for those, and we'll have one for adding, we'll have one for removing, and we'll have one for finding. And the adding is simple enough. It's just this.items.push, and then we push on the item. And the remove isn't much more complicated as well. We just need to get the index of the item we're trying to find. And we need to make sure that that index is not equal to -1. And if it's not equal to -1, then we can splice the items array. So let's go and include this script to our index.html. And back in our list, we need to set the list to the window down at the bottom. And then within Mapster, we'll import the list. So rather than setting this.markers to an empty array, we'll create a new list. So now down in our add marker function, rather than saying this._add marker, we'll say this.markers.add and then add the marker. And then down here, we can get rid of this _add marker. And as far as the remove marker goes, we have the same code in our list, so we can get rid of this as well. So let's go to our script.js, and then down here, let's console.log map.markers just to see what we get after we've added the two markers. So in our console, we see we have a list, and it has an items property with two markers in it. And if we come down here and check the prototype, we can see we have our add, find, and remove functions as well. So in our Mapster library, we had this function called find marker by lat. And this function would loop through all the markers, and it would return one that matched the lat we passed through as the parameter. And writing functions like this becomes a problem, because every time we want to find a marker by a specific property, we have to create another function. So rather than doing that, we want to create a function that can dynamically find an object by its property. So let's get rid of this function, and then we'll go into our list.js, and we'll start working on our find. So ideally, we'd call find like this. So essentially, we pass through a callback function that returns an item as a parameter, and we check to see if that item's property is equal to anything we want it to be. So inside our callback function, this is where we can evaluate what we want to find our object by. So we don't want to pass through an item for find, we want to pass through a callback. So we're going to create a variable, and we're going to call it callback return, because we want to be able to store the result of the callback. Then we're just going to alias the items, and then get their length. And then we're going to create an empty array for any potential matches we may find, because we won't just find one item in certain cases, we can find multiple items that satisfy the condition. And since we're going to be looping, we're going to set I equal to 0 up here. So we'll begin our loop. And the first thing we'll do inside this loop is get the result of the callback. The first parameter is the first item that we're at in the iteration. And the second parameter will just be that item's index. We don't need that item's index currently, but we might need it in the future, and right now there's no harm through passing it. So since the callback function evaluates a condition, it should always return a true or a false. So we'll do an if statement to see if the callback return is true, and if it's true, then we're going to push it on to our matches array. And then once we're done iterating, we're going to return the matches array. So now let's go to our mapster.js, and now we'll create a function called findBy, and then we'll just call this .markers.find, and we'll pass through the callback. And then we need to make sure that we're actually going to return the value. So we'll create a variable to store the found marker, and then we'll call map.findBy, and then we'll pass through our callback function that returns the marker as the parameter. And then what we'll do is we'll go into the second marker, and we'll provide it with an ID, and we'll set it to 2. And then what we'll do is we'll return marker.id is it triple equal to 2. And then we'll log found to the console. So you can see that we have an array of just one marker, and if we open up that marker, it has the ID of 2. So we've created our function that allows us to find a marker by any property. But what if we want to delete that marker from the map? Well, if we go back into list, we can do the same thing. If you remember, if you need to delete something from a map, not only do you have to remove it from the array, but you have to set the map to null for that marker. And we don't want to write that into our list because our list is agnostic of any object that's being passed to it. But what we can do is we can fire off a custom function once we've found all the matches inside the find function. So below the loop, we could check to see if there's some type of callback, and we'll just call it action. And if there's an action, we can say action call. We'll pass through this and the matches. So we'll make sure to pass through this action as a parameter. And now in our mapster, we'll create a method called removeBy. And removeBy will just take in a callback. So we can call find just like how we are above. We'll pass through the callback. And then right here is where we can pass through our own custom action. So this action will return us all the matches. And in this case, those matches are markers. So we can take this markers array and we can call a for each function on it. And this for each function is just like doing a loop, except this callback function executes for every single item inside of the array. So for each marker inside the markers array, we can then set the markers map to null. So now if we go to our script.js, we can call map.removeBy, and then we can pass through our callback function, and then we can return the marker that has an ID that's equal to 2. And you can see in our map that that marker was removed. And something you may have noticed is that there's a similarity of how we're passing through callback functions and how JavaScript passes through callback functions for the for each iterator. So if we create a random array, if we want to iterate through this random array, we call the for each method. And this for each method takes in the callback. And we can alert out each one of these items. So this concept of being able to pass through functions as parameters is extremely powerful because we can delay the invocation of this function until we actually need to fire it off. So in the case of removeBy and findBy, rather than having to create all of these methods to find a marker by a property, we only had to create one function, and that was the find function. And once we implemented that function, we were able to use it in multiple places. We were able to find all the markers we wanted to remove and then set them off of the map. So in this lesson, we created our own list collection. This provided us a way to do more advanced adding, removing, and finding of our objects. And even though we're working with map markers, we created this module to work with any type of item. We passed through callback functions so we could delay the invocation of them and fire them off when they were needed. And as time goes on, you notice that we'll get more markers added to our collection. As you can see right here, I created a loop that created random markers onto the map. And when we zoom out, they start overlapping on each other. And this amount of markers isn't particularly useful. What would be more useful is if we could cluster up all these markers together when we got out to a higher zoom. So in the next lesson, we'll focus on creating these clusters.